Hello everybody, how's it going? I hope you're doing well and your studies are going smoothly. Today we're going to explore the features and assumptions of the humanistic approach to psychology. We're going to talk about two of its founding fathers, Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, talk about their influence, their theories, their legacy, and then more generally discuss the pros and cons of the humanistic approach. So without further ado, let's crack on. Now, before we delve into the humanistic approach more specifically, it's worth considering the context in terms of the history and the origins of psychology. Now, of course, today we're putting a focus on the AQA specification for A-level psychology. And it is important that you are aware of the origins of psychology and the 6 different approaches named on the specification, but I think this sort of thing is interesting for its own sake anyway. Now, you'll be aware from your studies that Wilhelm Wundt is considered the father of psychology. You'll know that he set up the first experimental psychology lab, and that was in Leipzig in Germany in 1879. You'll know potentially about the work of Sigmund Freud and the psychodynamic psychologists of the very early 20th century, and their focus on unconscious conflict and the development of the personality. And you'll know that whilst that was the first sort of dominant paradigm in psychology, it wasn't that dominant for very long, because behaviourists such as John Watson and later B.F. Skinner came along and criticised the unscientific nature of that early work. Now, although Wundt wanted to apply the scientific method to psychology, and arguably he paved the way for psychology as a science, his focus on introspection, his focus on subjective reflection of our feelings and our thoughts and internal processes was very much unsatisfactory to the behaviourists. The behaviourists argued that psychology should be a science and should focus purely on objective, observable behaviours. So here we have 2 dominant paradigms in psychology, and we're shifting towards the scientific side of things. But then that didn't last too long either, because only 20 years later or so, humanistic psychologists in the early days, such as Abraham Maslow, argued that psychology had gone too far the other way, too far towards scientific method. And they would ask questions like, why are we researching animals when we're trying to understand human experience? Why are we focusing on observable, objective behaviours? Why are we rejecting the idea that we can study internal mental processes? And so the third force in psychology was born, humanistic psychology, based on the work of Maslow and Carl Rogers. Now, I'm not going to explore the other approaches today that came later, that's perhaps for another video, but we're going to delve into the assumptions of the humanistic approach now. So the humanistic approach to psychology argues that humans are self-driven, we are self-determining, we are motivated to achieve our potential. More on that in just a moment. Humanistic psychologists focus on the role of the self, so the self-concept and self-esteem. How we feel about ourselves, how we see ourselves, is hugely influential in behaviour and in well-being. Humanistic psychologists focus on the role of empowerment, so empowering people, the role of choice, and the role of taking responsibility and accepting responsibility for our choices and for our behaviour. So they argue that we have free will, or something close to it at least. Humanistic psychologists focus on the uniqueness and the subjectivity of human experience, and they therefore take a holistic and ideographic approach to psychology. Humanistic psychologists also reject the scientific method, and with good reason. They actively resist the scientific method because, for the reasons we've kind of talked about already, they don't think that people could be studied in controlled conditions in labs with any meaning. They think that you lose all validity and all meaning when you try to do it in that way. Right, let's take a moment to look at the work of Abraham Maslow, who is one of the most famous psychologists of all time and a founding father of the humanistic approach. Indeed, you'd probably heard of Maslow even before you studied psychology. I know he pops up in courses like business studies and media, and you've probably come across his hierarchy of needs in some form, somewhere, sometime. So Maslow was an American psychologist, but I think it's worth bearing in mind because I think sometimes, these backstories are quite interesting, that he is the son of first-generation immigrants. So his parents actually came from Kiev in, obviously, modern-day Ukraine. He is Jewish, and in his childhood he suffered a lot of persecution for being Jewish. And as I said, I think it's got quite an interesting backstory if you want to kind of go off and do any wider reading. But I think he spent a lot of time as a child in libraries among books, and probably that's where his love of studying and development kind of came from. But anyway, so what did Maslow say? What was his theory? Well, Maslow argued that humans are fundamentally driven towards what he called self-actualization. So Maslow said that basically we all want to be the best person that we can be. And he got this idea from case studies that he'd done on basically people that he considered to be the best of humanity. Most famously, perhaps, people like Albert Einstein. So he looked at these different people in society and tried to kind of look at what they had in common. And he was looking at things like, they were moral people, they were good, decent people, they were spontaneous, they had humour, they were wholesome, they were alive, they were creative, they understood reality for what it was, they accepted facts, they accepted responsibility for things, they were decent people. So this was his idea of self-actualization, this striving towards perfection, towards being the best that you can be. So he said that was a growth need, and we all wanted that, we all strive for that. But we can't achieve that unless we've achieved these lower levels in this hierarchy you can see on the screen there. What he called deficiency needs. So we are striving for self-actualization. We want to be the best we can be, but we can't be unless we meet these lower level needs. Starting off with our physiological needs, or sometimes called basic needs. The normal kind of stuff: water, sleep, food, and other things. Yeah, but if we meet those, then we can start to meet our safety needs. So feeling security, and that's security of body, security of health and mind. It's resources. It's maybe having a job security, having an income, that sort of thing. Yeah. So, and if we meet our safety needs, then we can then work on meeting our love and belonging needs. And if we achieve those, so we feel valued in relationships. That might be romantic, it might be friendship, it might be family. But if we meet those needs, then we can start to feel good about ourselves, and we can develop self-confidence. We can develop a sense of achievement, respect from other people. Yeah, self-esteem. And then only if we can meet all four of those levels, then we can strive towards self-actualization. Now, Maslow, his work really is kind of oversimplified in a lot of sources, and he never really kind of said it has to happen in those kind of strict levels. For him, it was freer than that. This was very much an individual thing, and some of these things will mean different things to different people, which is kind of in line with the approach in general, isn't it, based on what we've said already. But it's worth being aware of examples of each of these levels. Okay, so let's take a moment now to look at the work of Carl Rogers, the second father of humanistic psychology. I think Rogers, I've got a lot of time for Rogers' work. I think he's underappreciated in some ways by modern psychology, maybe by, the A-level curriculum. He's got a lot to give. He's left a powerful legacy, I think, for psychology, and he's contributed more than I think he gets credit for in the textbooks. So Rogers, really, his main contribution to be aware of is his work on the self and his development of theories of self-concept. Now, he said that self-esteem is, and there's a link there to Maslow's work, of course, in the fourth level of the hierarchy of needs, but Rogers is talking about the development of self-concept, how that works, and how other people influence us. Now, he said that other people can affect our development of self-esteem because getting positive regard, he called it, so getting kind of respect and getting like value and kind of love and respect from other people helps us to develop self-worth, or it certainly can affect our development of self-worth. Now, a positive self-image, positive self-esteem for Rogers, that's necessary for mental health, being healthy. Now, when limits or boundaries are placed upon our self-worth and our feelings of value, so, for example, if a parent kind of gives the impression that they might disown a child unless they become a doctor or become a lawyer, or maybe a parent or a friend doesn't want to listen to you or respect your point of view unless they agree with you, then Rogers said that leads to the development of what he called conditions of worth. Basically what he's saying is that we only feel good about ourselves in this situation when we receive this love and acceptance from other people. And therefore, if we don't do what other people want, we don't feel good about ourselves. And that is not a healthy place to be for Rogers. Now, another concept that goes alongside this is Rogers' idea of congruence. Now, you might be aware of the term congruence from maths, for example. So congruent shapes are identical shapes. So I think that is a way into understanding this concept. Because for Rogers, congruence was about where you are the person that you want to be. So he said that we all have a self-concept, as we've talked about already, our self-esteem. But also we have an ideal self. We have a picture of the person that we want to be. The person, and again, maybe there's a link to Maslow's work here, the person that we kind of would be in an ideal world, our ideal self. Okay. Now, if those things match or closely match, then Rogers said that we're in a state of congruence. And we are, he would say, living the good life. We're in a state of congruence. That's mental health. We're feeling good about ourselves and we can succeed. Now, if that isn't the case, if there isn't much of an overlap between the self-concept or the self-image and the ideal self, the self we want to be, then we don't experience congruence. We're incongruent or we're having a lack of congruence. And that's where we get mental health issues. That's where we get anxiety and depression, low self-esteem, and negative feelings of self-worth. Now, Rogers is also well known for attempting to, despite the humanistic approach kind of rejecting scientific methods, Rogers is also known for developing ways of measuring previously unmeasurable things like attitudes and subjective feelings towards concepts and towards people. And he developed something called the Q-sort method. He didn't invent the original method, but he developed a way of using it to measure subjective things like attitudes by getting people to kind of rank statements or indicate their agreement with statements in relation to each other. So you might not need to necessarily be aware of the Q-sort. I've seen it on a couple of mark schemes as credit-worthy material for exams, but I just think that's an interesting point because a lot of the textbooks say, humanistic psychology is not scientific at all. But in reality, Rogers did actually carry out a fair bit of research and wanted really to deliver and develop therapies that were at least partially evidence-based. He did reflect a lot on his therapy and the way that he worked with clients. He recorded sessions. He analysed what happened on those recordings, and he wanted to improve things and to be better. So, like I said, I think Rogers is maybe underappreciated, and even though he wouldn't maybe say, we need to quantify everything and be objective, I would hesitate to say, there's no kind of evidence or there's no rigour in what Rogers did. So, as I said, a lot of time for Rogers' work, a lot of respect for him. All right, let's carry on. All right, so we've discussed the work of Maslow and Rogers. We've talked about the overall assumptions and features of the humanistic approach to psychology, and it's time to reflect on the pros and cons of the approach, the legacy and the value of this approach to psychology. I think a key strength of the humanistic approach is the applications, particularly to therapy. Now, I touched on it when I was talking a moment ago about the work of Carl Rogers, but he developed what's called person-centered therapy. He didn't call them patients, the people that came for his help. He called them clients. And I think that represents a fundamental shift in attitude compared to other approaches such as the work of Freud and, even behaviourist approaches to therapy for mental health. Rogers saw people that came to him as clients, people that want some support and some guidance perhaps, so more of a coaching kind of role. But fundamentally, he believed that people could unlock solutions for themselves, and he was there to provide them with empathy and with respect. And this was a really successful therapy for many people that Rogers worked with. He helped them to reduce the gap between their ideal self and their self-concept, and so achieve congruence and be healthy and positive. He helped to remove conditions of worth through that empathy and that respect and that unconditional positive regard. So I think there's a really powerful strength here in terms of the applications to counselling. Arguably, Rogers revolutionised approaches to mental health and how the therapist-client relationship worked. And yet, critics of the humanistic approach argue that maybe these applications aren't as effective as they could have been. What Rogers tended to work with might be considered more mild conditions, mild anxiety, mild self-esteem issues, mild depression, feeling low. In which case, coaching, empathy, respect, giving people a space to talk is really useful. But could this approach cure a condition that is biological in origin? No. Is it appropriate for more severe, debilitating conditions? No. Is it appropriate for something that affects the way that a person can communicate or the way that a person views reality? Something like psychosis, schizophrenia? No, it's not appropriate for conditions like that. And so on balance, perhaps, although there are some really promising applications and maybe he did revolutionise counselling, maybe those applications are limited. It's not an appropriate way to deal with all mental health disorders. Furthermore, critics of this approach would argue that the unscientific nature is a massive problem. The lack of control, the lack of objectivity, the lack of replication, the untestable nature of the concepts that we're talking about, things like self, things like esteem, a lot of this is all unobservable, isn't it? And so it's not testable. These concepts lack falsification. Now, if you're being really harsh, you might say that humanistic psychology undid the good work of the early behaviourists and people like Wilhelm Wundt, maybe even bringing psychology as a science into disrepute. And I wouldn't say that. I think that's really unfair. Because actually, there's a reason that they reject scientific approaches. There's a reason that humanistic psychologists don't use the scientific method. Is science the only way? It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. And I think sometimes the value of scientific methodology is maybe overplayed in psychology. Now, I do think that psychology is a science overall, and I think that it should try to be a science where possible and appropriate. But it's not the only way to do psychology, and I think there's a real place for approaches like humanistic psychology that are focusing more on uniqueness and individuality, focusing more on idiographic ways of treating mental health, of understanding behaviour, because, doing controlled lab studies, yes, that's really valuable, but it's not the whole picture. And, you could get into a debate here about ecological validity and all things like that, but I think fundamentally just science, and this kind of leads into the next point, science is maybe an oversimplification of human existence. It's a reductionist way of, we're isolating variables in a very unique setting in a lab. It's not the only way of looking at what it means to be human and what it means to behave and to interact with other people. So, yeah, I think it would be unfair to just say that the humanistic approach is unscientific and that's a problem. I think there's definitely a counter-argument there. And as I kind of said, this anti-reductionist kind of view of humanistic psychology is, again, potentially a strength. It captures the subjectivity, it captures the depth and detail, it seeks to kind of understand the meaning of behaviour, and you don't get that from a lot of the other approaches. So this focus on holism, the holistic approach that humanistic psychology takes, I think is really powerful and really valuable. If you compare it to something like behaviourism or something like the biological approach, then I think there's a real place for this, because those other approaches miss out on that bigger picture by oversimplifying behaviour, by taking a reductionist approach to psychology. And yet, perhaps it's not quite reductionist enough. I think there's a place for holism, but one of the problems with holistic approaches to psychology is that maybe they just overcomplicate things. Maybe actually we do need to reduce things down a little bit. Because otherwise, theories, concepts, approaches are really difficult, if not impossible, to do anything with. If we just say, oh, well, everything affects us and we have free will, okay, great, but what do I do with that? Where do I start with this problem that I want to solve? Where do I start with this study that I want to do? Oh, I can't do a study? Oh, okay, well, what do I do then? So, again, I think there's a time and a place for holism and reductionism. And in reality, probably we want a bit of a balance. A lot of the approaches that we study at A-level are very much reductionist. They're only really looking at one factor, one variable. But this kind of maybe doesn't go reductionist enough. Maybe we need somewhere in the middle. And perhaps that's where something like social learning theory comes in, blending a few different ideas together, saying that we do have a little bit of control over our environment and over how we respond to things in that kind of soft determinist way. Okay. Anyway, I've probably gone off on too much of a tangent there. Alright, so that was me waffling about the humanistic approach to psychology. I quite like this as an approach. How do you guys feel about it? Let me know down in the comments. If you want to go above and beyond and support the channel, then you could check out my Patreon link. You can follow me on X. You can buy my revision Wordsearch book. But it's just great to hear from people in the comments. Do consider subscribing if you're not already subscribed. Thanks very much, guys. Stay safe. I'll see you in another video. Alright, all the best.